All right, we have a great conversation ahead of us, so we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Jasper Collier, and I'm the Oral History Project Manager for Humanities DC, the State Humanities Council for Washington, DC. Today's program will be recorded, and the recording will be made available on Humanities DC's YouTube channel. Thank you for joining us for this month's edition of the DC Oral History Collaborative Coffee Chat. The Coffee Chat highlights the work of those working to document and preserve Washington stories through oral history. I'd also like to thank Humanities DC Programs Coordinator Tracy Mullery for producing this program, and Heidi Thomas, who's providing the live transcription captioning for us this morning. So feel free to turn on those closed captions if you'd like. I want to start by briefly talking about the DC Oral History Collaborative, Washington's citywide oral history project, and its role in encouraging and supporting projects like the ones you'll hear about this morning. The collaborative began in 2017 as a partnership between Humanities DC, the DC Public Library, and the DC History Center. Its overarching goal is to encourage residents. Collaborative has sought to achieve communities, and by offering grants that are supported by grant programs, over 50 projects across the city that have collected nearly 300 individual interviews. Almost half of these have been added to the People's Archive at the DC Public Library, where they're accessible through the library's catalog of digital resources, Dig DC. This month for the Coffee Chat, we're diverting from our typical focus on an oral history project that was supported through that grants program, and instead we'll welcome 3 oral historians who have participated in the collaborative's training program. At least 2 times per year, the collaborative offers free training in oral history best practices to the public. The workshops are held over 3 days, and they introduce participants to a combination of practical skills and theoretical knowledge. Since 2017, nearly 160 people have taken advantage of these trainings, with facilitators Benji de la Piedra, the conversation today will actually be moderated by Benji de la Piedra. As I mentioned, Benji has facilitated the training, but he also wrote the original version of the DCOHC training materials and facilitated those early workshops. Benji is a writer, educator, and public historian whose work focuses on American media, history, literature, spirituality, and art. He holds a master's degree in oral history from Columbia University, teaches oral history courses at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock and the University of the District of Columbia, and edits oral history transcripts for the Smithsonian's Archives of American Art. Benji directs the Herbert Denton Biography Project at UDC and is working on a biography of Herbert Denton Jr., the Washington Post's first African-American city editor. Benji is an active member of the Oral History Association, serving on its Diversity Committee and Equity Audit Task Force, presenting regularly at its annual meetings since 2016, and co-chairing a symposium on race and power in oral history that is set to take place via Zoom webinar under the auspices of UC Berkeley's Oral History Center in the last week of June 2022. Currently, he is a visiting scholar at the John W. Kluge Center for Scholars at the Library of Congress, where he is working on a book of ideas about journalism, race, civil unrest, and the theme of heroism, which ties together his research and reflections on Afro-American intellectuals Herbert Denton, Albert Murray, and Ralph Ellison around the cultural shifts of the George Floyd protest moment. Benji consults on oral history projects around the United States and is proud to have gotten a start doing so for the DC Oral History Collaborative in 2017 as its inaugural curriculum developer, workshop instructor, and volunteer coordinator. So please feel free to use the chat throughout the program for comments and discussion. But if you have questions along the way, and certainly when we open things up to questions from the audience, please use the Q&A feature to ask those questions, just because it makes it a little bit easier for us to keep track of those. But with that, I will turn things over to Benji. Thanks, Benji.
Thank you, Jasper. Thank you so much. I'm really honored and thankful to have gotten the invitation from you to host this month's coffee chat. As you mentioned, the DC Oral History Collaborative is in a fundamental way where it all began. For me as a teacher of oral history. And so it's with a lot of respect and humility and most of all enthusiasm that I'm approaching today's coffee chat, which has been a couple months in the works. Perhaps as our panelists can talk about our behind the scenes discussion of how we came to what we're each going to talk about today. So our goal for today, and for talking about from training to practice, is to commemorate and pay some homage to the fact that oral history work and the adoption of an identity as an oral historian, this is something we'll talk about today, is in itself a kind of journey, a really beautiful journey. Those who have taken my workshops know that I like to emphasize life's journeys as probably the fundamental thing that we're trying to document and understand when we interview an individual in an oral history fashion. And that's because journeys draw out the best in us. They throw the unexpected at us. They force us to become more resourceful, and they shape our perspectives, what we'll leave behind, what we'll be in a position to teach others who will then have to go through similar kinds of initiation experiences. And so today I'm excited to kind of turn the table a little bit and examine the ways in which becoming an oral historian in and of itself is a kind of journey. And so I'm hoping that this can be useful and interesting to the oral historians in training who are in the house. And we're all oral historians in training. Even I am, like, we're still always learning, always getting better. And so the goal is just to, hear from each of our panelists a few clips that have been lined up that they're going to use to make their, offer a few introductory reflections on, what they've learned about oral history, how they've shaped their own practice, to the craft. And then from there, we're just going to have a jam session. And so I'm so excited. These are three of my good friends, three of the standout students. We had many standout students, but three of the standout students from that initial round of the 2017 workshops that I had the chance to teach for the DC Oral History Collaborative. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce everyone right now in the order in which they'll present, and then the three panelists will present their clips, offer their remarks, and then, like I said, we'll just move into a jam session from there. And just for folks to be mindful of time, we'll wrap up just a few minutes before 12:30 Eastern time. So we have about an hour and 20 minutes to jam. So our first panelist today is going to be Pandit Wright. Pandit is a former executive with Discovery Communications and the immediate past president of the Boys and Girls Clubs of Greater Washington. In 2017, she attended a DCOHC presentation featuring an oral history of DC's Bloomingdale neighborhood and decided to bring her love of stories and storytelling to the workshop the collaborative was offering. And I distinctly remember this. For my part, I can say I distinctly remember this, and it was really a joy to have you in the space, Pandit. Pandit regularly worships at the historic Asbury United Methodist Church in downtown DC. And as a result of attending the volunteer workshops that I taught, she was invited to participate in a grant project, a DC Oral History Collaborative grant-funded project with fellow workshop alum and Asbury United Methodist Church member Adele Banks, who I believe is in the house today. Hi, Adele. Pandit has also participated in two additional projects, and I can also say, maybe we'll talk about this. Pandit has been doing my life history over time. We haven't done it in a little bit, but one of the ways in which the training was put into practice and a really beautiful relationship developed was that Pandit just said, like, who's doing your story? And I said, nobody yet. And so we've got this, this other kind of jam session going between the two of us. So, so first we'll have Pandit. Second, we'll have Damien Frierson. Damien's a social worker by training and by profession with a background in African-American studies and history. As a native Washingtonian, he has an interest in local DC history and culture, as well as the city's oldest Black churches. In addition to working at the United States Department of Health and Human Services, Damien serves on the board of directors for the Zora Neale Hurston Richard Wright Foundation, and as an assistant church historian at the Alfred Street Baptist Church, the historic Alfred Street Baptist Church in Alexandria, Virginia. Damien, I will say, has made a note here in his bio that he has chosen not to list his education and background, but I can tell you this is Dr. Frierson we're talking to here. I know that from having gone to church with him. They don't let him forget that. And so we've also agreed that Damien might end up becoming my straw person for the day when I start talking about social science and how social scientists don't always get it or need a little bit of molding. So we'll leave it at that. And if it comes up, it comes up. Thank you, Damien. Finally, we'll have Judy Wexman. Judy has lived in DC since 1977. She is an attorney who has specialized in access to healthcare for low-income people and reproductive health and rights. She has always been interested in history and is the unofficial, but definitely recognized historian of her neighborhood, Woodley Park. She took part in the first oral history training sponsored by DC Humanities, DC Oral History Collaborative, which is what we're talking about today. After interviewing some folks in her neighborhood, she took on other oral history projects, including one for the National Family Planning and Reproductive Health Association, better known as NIFRA, and another for the Veteran Feminists of America. And both of those projects, I think, is what Judy's going to talk about today. Judy presented on her NIFR project at the 2020 Oral History Association's annual meeting. And I can just add, for my part, maybe we'll talk about this. I did quite a bit of transcription for the first round of that project, the first round of interviews, and got to learn a lot and really got a sense of Judy's, what Judy brings to the table as a lawyer. That was really interesting to see, to listen to oral histories conducted by a lawyer. That's a very, very particular kind of style and a very useful one in certain kinds of interviews. So excited to maybe talk about that a little bit too. So that's it from me for now. We'll now turn to Pandit, and I believe Tracy has the clips lined up. So whenever you're ready to have those played, Pandit, just say the word and it'll get done. Thank you. And you're muted.
Okay, am I not muted now? Okay, great. Thank you, Benji. Thank you, Jasper and Tracy and everyone. And for those of you who are attending today. After you've heard all of those introductions, et cetera, I have to tell you that I am sitting here very much new kid on the block, never going to describe myself as an oral historian. I would be an oral historian in training, I hope, which all started with Benji. I truly came, having worked for Discovery Channel, I came as a storyteller, but also I have a life of human resources interviewing. And what I was trying to explain to my fellow panelists is, and what I would say to anyone in the audience who is learning and who is just thinking about what oral history can be for you, I represent the part of, I guess, of the genre that's really about normal people trying to listen to other normal people and just hear their stories. Sort of like, I like portraits, right? Because they're going to tell you the journey, the story of a life. I don't plan on ever publishing. I don't plan on doing anything of that nature. But what I have loved and what I look forward to is, can I use these skills to capture the stories from my own family, from my own friends, when I meet people. And as Benji says, that I'm doing his oral history. And I started laughing. I'm saying, like, dude, I'm about like 3 times older than you. And I'm not even ready to tell my story. You ready to tell your story? Okay, let's go. Because we know that it is a journey and that these stories evolve. So I only have one clip to show you. I'm not ready just yet, but I want to talk about why I picked this particular clip. There are so many things, I believe, in the field of oral history when you begin to try to practice it. Some things you can control. And I think what I learned, especially in this last project in Zoom season, is that there are so many others that you can't control. And what I would just constantly say to people is, what you can control is your preparation. The sort of guide that Benji did when we did our training, I've said to him, it's kind of like the Bible. And I love the title of it, which is, I believe, Benji, the moves of the interviewer, because that's really what everything is, isn't it? It's the session, it's the pas de deux, it's the whole, sort of the back, I'm going to go here, you're going to go there. How are we going to do it? How am I, as the interviewer, going to be able to use that dreaded control word, right? Because I got to let this flow, but I also know that I have to control what we're doing to a certain extent. Otherwise, we're going to be here for 4 or 5 hours. Now, when we don't have 4 or 5 hours, particularly when you do have a structure that you have to fit into. It was a different thing. If I'm going to sit down and talk with Benji, that's one thing. But if I'm going to interview people that have been picked for a particular project, not just by myself, but as a team, and there are certain messages and things that we want to hear from them and certain experiences. But again, you can control your preparation. You can control the fact that you really have to learn, because as I say, I came as an employment interviewer. That's a whole separate structure. It's a whole different way of approaching people, and it's challenging. The other thing I will say is the projects that I was involved in are with Asbury United Methodist Church. And to that extent, most of the people that we were trying to capture their stories and their journeys, they're far along in the journey. And that's another challenge because you know, sometimes their memory is not going to be what you hope it would be. And just their particular, you know, the things that they might wish to share. Again, you just must prepare and know as much as you can, but you must be patient. The other part of what I wanted to say about the oral history process that we learned, it's the technical part behind the scenes. You know, I just kind of strolled in there thinking, okay, I know how to interview. I can be, you know, I can ad lib. I'm not going to be afraid of this process. So I'm just going to sit down and have a conversation. That's fine, but that's just the first part. And you, when you are preparing your team of people that are going to bring this oral history to life, it is so imperative that you also pay attention to whatever the technical components are that are necessary. In other words, when we talked about transcription of what you put down, you know, do you have the right machine? Do you have the right microphone? I will not go into all of this, but just understand that there, in addition to the beauty of sharing of ideas, is the infrastructure, the work that has to be done. We were fortunate in that we had Benji, who was generous with his time. He cared about the work. He came and paid attention to it after the work was done. He came to churches to understand the context of the work. And that is also, that's a blessing. So before we hear this one clip, I want to, again, I said I would say why I picked it. So it's an illustration, and I'm going to say that right off the top, the audio quality is not good. We heard it again yesterday, but it's an illustration, again, of what you can control. So here we are in the time of Zoom. I have a 95-year-old woman who has been a groundbreaker in her work in the church and also in the federal government, very much interested always in the fate of women. And this Black woman, you know, what can I do? How can I live my life? You know, she's got to better her own self and make her own way, having moved to Washington, D.C. when she was 9 years old from a farm in South Carolina. And she was very clear that she did not want to do country work. She wasn't going to do it. She wanted to come to the district, and she was happy that she was here. Okay, long life. Where do you go in that when you know that her stamina is not what it could be, right? So she's fighting to get her words out. Was it the right choice, right? Should we have taken this person? As interesting as her story is, and then add in Zoom. Lovely. However, Zoom has this marvelous quality that it compresses the noise so that you can't hear a lot of the outside noise. That's going to affect your sound quality when you go to play it back, right? At the almost towards the middle of the interview, I'm sitting there, you won't see me, but I'm sitting there with my big old professional Super Duty headphones on, and I begin to hear noise like Armageddon. And I am thinking that my entire block is blowing up outside, and I am frightened. I'm like, what is going on, aside from what it's doing to my interview? And I finally, you know, when the interview was over, I said, Reverend Pierce, did you hear all that noise? And she says in her little voice, you know, I live in the flight path of Andrews Air Force Base. Oh, we get that all the time. I'm like, okay, again, a control issue that I should have done. Last point before we go, letting it just sort of be organic to some extent. You must be organic. I'm sorry, this is the social science point I'm sure that Benji and Dave, you know, are going to talk about, but organic. So at the very end, what you do with any interview, whatever kind it is, you say, is there something we should cover here today that we haven't done that you want to talk about? And she says, oh, yes. And that's what you're going to hear now. And then I'll just explain 1 minute after she speaks. So thank you. Anything that you would like to say before we close our time today?
Oh, I want to, oh, yes, that was something I want to say. I want to say about the people that I live in my life. And the about work environment, and particularly at the Department of Commerce, where I work very diligently to improve the working conditions for women there. And And then also the being able to have that person, Mother Teresa, and Calcutta, and to see her in the world, but to see her, the baby, one of the babies, Jesus, in home, and to experience her around a big pot of food that we have on the street for people coming by for the hump and it's
So can you imagine? You finish the whole interview and somebody goes, oh yeah, I want to tell you about I met Mother Teresa. And there's a few other things that she came out with then. So, you know, I'm just saying it was a wonderful experience. Does not always net you the result that you want, but it was still a fabulous walk down a journey of life and a life that was significant. So thank you for the opportunity to talk about that.
Great. Thanks so much, Pandit. Excited to hear more in our discussion. I just want to flag before we transition to Damien, you know, what you're drawing out here about preparation, there's a very strong and I would say essential connection between preparation and the ability to improvise, which is a letting go of control, right? Like improvisation does not mean you just get up there and do whatever happens to come to mind. It's actually that ability. This is again part of why journeys draw out so much in us, is it's that ability to you know, in a moment of truth or in a moment of, you know, quick decision, to draw on everything that you have prepared beforehand and knowing exactly what kind of move to make or not to make, right? Sometimes it's just that letting go. So just want to flag that as a key theme that I'm sure we'll draw out later, preparation and improvisation as part of the oral history craft. Thanks, Pandit.
Thank you.
Damien, Dr. Damien, excuse me.
You know, it's still hard not to blush every time somebody says Dr. anything, Dr. Frierson or anything. So thank you for making me blush on Saturday morning. I won't go into too much background about myself, but I think when Pandit was talking, I remember the email that I sent during the first part of our class, it was the intro email that you sent, Benji. It was a response. So tell me a little bit about yourself and why you're interested in oral history. And I remember I spent 2 paragraphs talking about how I was a social worker and how I was drawn to this class because, you know, this course because of my background in qualitative research. And I think like Pandit pointed out, I think you think you're coming with certain interview skills. However, it wasn't until I took your class that I started to question, okay, how good of a listener am I? Or how present am I actually in these interviews that I have done? And kind of also starting to think, okay, getting away from the thematic approach to doing an interview. Ooh, they're talking about what I want to hear. Okay, now let's move on to something else. So, and I'll talk a little bit about that after I kind of go into the clips that I have here. But just a little bit of background about the project that I kind of started during my time in the course. So my project really focused on, or my interviews really focused on the 19th Street Baptist Church in Washington, D.C. 19th Street Baptist Church was founded in 1839. So it is the first independent Black Baptist congregation in the city of Washington. And it really rose to prominence. I want to say really between the late 19th century, early 20th century, because it was under the pastorate of Walter Henderson Brooks, and he pastored the church from 1882 to 1946. So you're talking about a span of 64 years. And when we think of churches like 15th Street Presbyterian, Metropolitan AME, this church really kind of became like the center, or really attracted a lot of the city's Black professional and middle class. So you had people like Charles Drew, Nannie Helen Burroughs really attending these churches and, kind of bringing their prominence and their name to the church. And they were also known for this massive choir that really sung like these hymns and the anthems of the church. And I think where these interviews kind of come into play is that there were very few people that actually remember that period. And I think it's important to note that Walter Henderson Brooks he spent, I think, the first 14 years of his life as a slave. So to actually have members who could talk about hearing him use that experience in his sermons, you don't have too many of those folks. And I think, as Pandit mentioned, a lot of the people that we actually even focused on as a part of the project were in their 90s or close to that centenarian mark. So, fast forward, I think once I heard about the forum, I reached out to the pastor, Reverend Roberts at 19th Street Baptist Church, told him about it, and he put me in contact with Deaconess E. Louise White. At that time, she was the chair of the Board of Deaconesses, and they had really been focused on trying to create a history-driven project, preserving the history of the church. And when I introduced this to them, E. Louise, she thought this would be a great opportunity to really capture some of those memories or experiences of those of people who had actually been a member of this church for 80 years or more. And we got a few of the 80 years, but we actually moved it down a little bit to the 75-year mark. So when you're hearing these folks, I picked two interviews. One is with E. Louise White, who was the chairwoman, and kind of participated with me. And then the other is Jean Jordan. I think Jean Jordan is the first one that we'll start with. She comes from a family that has multiple generations who grew up in this church. I believe it was her paternal grandparents and her parents were all members of the church prior to her being born and joining the church in 1939. And then the other interview will be with E. Louise White, and I'll do a little bit of intro for her as well. And the reason I picked these, because I think it really, I picked these two interviews because it really highlights what I like to call the intentional, unintentional of oral history. So I guess we can start with Jean Jordan.
And it was a church there was a lot of decorum in that.
Are we having some technical difficulties?
Sorry, I just closed out the link. I'm
No
just
worries,
going to pull it back
making
up.
sure. Take your time. Thanks, Tracy. And while she's doing that, Damien, can you quickly remind me, because I'm getting it down in my notes. Did you say the intentional unintentional or the unintentional intentional?
It's the intentional unintentional.
The intentional unintentional. Okay.
Yeah. And I guess kind of to give some background while Tracy is getting the link up, the prompt was, tell me what stands out to you when you think about the congregation.
Great.
And so for, there's some backstory. And like I said, I'll give a little bit of the backstory afterwards. But again, I think that prompt for me was kind of the intentional, but the unintentional kind of starts to reveal some of the journey that I kind of wanted to see, but I didn't want to impose. So
there you go. Great. Awesome.
Okay, and I can pull that up now.
Thanks, Tracy.
This thing is that. And it was a church there was a lot of decorum in that church. And there was also something else that Jerry used to just absolutely come unglued about. People had their pews. It's my pew. Okay? And people sat in their pew. Jerry said, no. You don't, nobody has purchased a pew. You sit wherever. So he sort of broke that down. But when I was a child, it was a known fact that sister so-and-so or brother so-and-so, whatever, sat in that pew. And then they would sometimes even sit classified by positions. Not positions in the church necessarily, but positions outside. Like you could tell that all the school teachers were sitting over there. You know, you could tell that all the maybe government workers may be sitting here. But that, and I think that's how we got a reputation that was not, God. See, I never suffered from that reputation because having grown up there, you see, you wouldn't suffer from it. You wouldn't even be aware that it exists. But maybe if you come in as a new person, you might somehow or another feel it. But see, I never felt it because, first of all, I was too young to even be aware of any such thing as that. But I understand from later life that all this existed. Mrs. Booker told me mostly about it.
Oh, okay. And Mrs. Booker is?
Mrs. Booker was our church clerk for many, many years.
Okay.
From the time I can remember as a child. She's one of the most prominent women in the church. Mm-hmm. Based on the fact that she was the church clerk and then later became chairman of the Board of Deaconess. And that was the position she held when she died. She was chairman of the Board of Deaconess for God knows how many years. Good Lord, I mean, that, as long as I can remember. And she was church clerk. And at the time, the Constitution even said you couldn't hold two positions. Like that. But somehow, I guess the church gave her, permission. And so she had those two positions, church clerk and chairman of the deaconess board. Wow. But anyway, she told me about a lot of this, about how the people sat categorized by the positions they held outside. But see, I wasn't really aware of that.
Right.
I mean, so this is sort of hearsay on my part.
Right.
I mean, just based on what she...
Okay, so can you all hear me? Okay, great. So that was Jean Jordan, and I laugh because it's if you were ever to have a chance to meet Jean Jordan, you wouldn't be able to say her first name without her last name. That's just, I think you can kind of get the sense that's the personality that she brings. I really I admire both of these women, and I really developed a relationship with them. But the second clip is of Eloise White, and her family migrated to Washington, D.C. In the early 40s. And they started going to 19th Street in between, I want to say between 44, 45. And she became a member around that time. So the second clip, again, is of Eloise White. And again, she actually eventually became the chairwoman of the Board of Deaconesses.
Therefore, my sister and I, Geraldine, enjoyed a lot of nurturing at this church. We lived in the basement of a big apartment building, which my father was the building engineer, but that never seemed to matter to the members of the church. They accepted us, took us under their wings. My mother knew how to sew, and so therefore if there was a church program, Sunday school or whatever, she overnight almost would make us new dresses. And if she had enough notice and it was in the winter, we'd have coat and a dress to go with the occasion. And so this kind of nurturing of our church, to me, is probably the most significant part in my development. Mainly because it wasn't until I maybe got into junior high school when I realized, I probably was very naive at that time, that there was such a thing as some people had a lot more money than my family did. In many ways, my church never differentiated. And it was afterwards that I knew some of the people who were there, who did have means, with lots of doctors, lawyers, teachers who had been teachers for a long time. One who comes to mind is Geraldine L.M. Tate, really a legendary person. Was a spinster, school teacher, but she gave up all her monies to the church so that even today we have a book award that's given in her name. by the Helping Hand.
Okay. All right. So I don't want to take, so I'm going to try to be brief with this because I don't want to take time from Judy. But again, the prompt was, tell me what stands out to you when you think about the congregation. And I think if you read any text on Black Washington during this time, it often references 19th Street as, for lack of a better word, amongst one of the elite Black churches in the city. And so, but you rarely hear these accounts coming from the members themselves. So you're kind of left wondering, is this mythology? Where does this really come from? And I want to make sure that I put this, I say this, I wanted to explore this, but I also wanted this to be about their narrative. I wanted this to be about Jean Jordan and E. Louise's journey. So, you know, when you really listen to this kind of came up organically. And I think that is a part of that oral history journey. It comes up organically, or you kind of figure out a way to, you know, maybe find your way back to where it was that you want to kind of, you know, probe a little bit more, or really get them to talk a little bit more about. And I think particularly with these interviews, what really stood out to me was that, of course, you had the reflective piece. You also get that insider outsider piece with, you know, kind of Jean Jordan really talking about being the insider, E. Louise talking about being the insider outsider, but it's the introspection that really hit me, in that they talk about class, but they're talking about it in the sense of where they are in that and how it felt. And so I go back to these interviews and I listen to them, you know, all the time. And I really wonder if I had talked about from that, you know, because, you know, as a traditional researcher, sometimes you just go straight for what you want to hear. If I had said, tell me about the class dynamics, or I've heard about class, or tell me how you felt, would I have really gotten that level of introspection that you get in those little clips? So I think that that's really something that stands out to me. And I have to say, I mean, class is a very sensitive topic, but what these women both did was they put it in the context of their own observations and their own life. And I think out of that, you really get a sense of how even those class dynamics really kind of felt like uplift, particularly for E. Louise. I won't really talk. I'll say the qualitative, you know, that whole piece for the end, or if Benji, if you want to go into that. But I think the last couple of things I'll just say is that I think from taking your class, the thing that I really took from it was the beginning. And I use that outside of oral history now, because I think from these interviews, the context was so important. And I probably wouldn't have been able to really process that or really think about what it meant in the sum total of their journey if I hadn't started thinking about their childhood, beginning at the very beginning. Sometimes it seems kind of ambiguous or amorphous to actually say, tell me about your childhood, or, you know, tell me about growing up. But it gives you that context. So when I did start working with E. Louise, because that was the other part of this, I started working with E. Louise to actually to co-facilitate some of these interviews or do two of them. I was very nervous because I'd never done interviews together with anybody, you know. So we worked that out. I think E. Louise brings that perspective. And in many cases, she had some of those perspectives. But we kind of worked on how not to impose, but still use her experience as a way to provide prompts. Because again, we were working with folks who were, you know, in their late 90s, you know, to that centenarian mark. So she was critical to that. I could not have done those interviews without her. The other was Train the Trainer. They asked me to come back because I'm not a member now at 19th Street. Again, I'm at Alfred Street now. But they asked me to come back and do a Train the Trainer, where for their 180th, they wanted to interview families that had been there longer. So I pulled from a lot of your material. I think I used the moves, and I also used the essential steps to kind of work with them. And I used the interview that you just listened to kind of, you know, what a good interview sounds like where you're not injecting. And then the last thing, I mean, with Hurston Wright, we actually did get a Humanities DC grant, and I worked with a journalist to kind of do an oral history for the founders of the organization. And the first thing I did when I looked at that script, I said, oh, these are good questions, but we need to begin at the beginning. We want to know more about who they are and what they brought to the founding of this organization. So I think, sum total, I appreciate more so the journey of what oral and how oral history kind of focuses you on that journey. And hopefully, organically, things just come to be.
Man, that's awesome. So much respect, Damien. Thank you. Really honored to hear all of that. Wow, I took a lot of notes, and I don't want to cut into Judy's time either. The one thing I'll say is that oral history is a negotiation of agendas, right? This is something that I talk about a lot when I teach, and that this is kind of the difference between, what we do and what the straw person social scientist does, is that we show up with an agenda, and that's great, right? Like, it's not wrong or manipulative to have an agenda. Like, it gives structure, it ensures that you're not wasting the narrator's time. You have a job to do, you have things you're curious about, you want to make the most of the 2 hours or however much time you have with them. But it's the sort of the lightness of the deployment and the flexibility of the deployment of that agenda. And just to the points that you're making here, the way in which a question like what stands out to you, that's a question that's so open, and really is a kind of invitation. This is another thing about oral history, I think, that makes us different as interviewers, is that oftentimes our questions are not commands or directions as much as they are invitations. As Alessandro Portelli, one of our, if not the greatest theorist in the field, calls it, it's the opening of a narrative space, not just a tool for research. And then what I add to that is also, and you were getting at this too, Damien, like oral history, and you're talking about introspection, it's also an invitation. It's the creation of a space for thinking together, or allowing the person to think through, their experience. And you as the oral historian are often an agent of consciousness raising and even consciousness refining. And so just some thoughts I wanted to make sure we get in there. Okay, so now we'll transition to Judy, who's going to talk about a slightly different set of topics, but I think a really great way to close out our initial opening notes here, and then we'll transition to our discussion. Thanks, Damien. Thanks, Judy. You're muted. Judy, you're muted.
So sorry. Okay, so I see you on the screen, Benji. I don't know if that's correct, but anyway, that's fine with me. Okay, so yeah, I have a little different path. I mean, as Benji said in my bio, I have always loved history and love history in DC in my neighborhood. And so when I saw the announcement calling for people who'd like to get trained as oral historians, I'm like, this is for me. And I did them in my neighborhood, and they were just fabulous. So this is about how like one thing just leads to another. I did not have a plan to necessarily continue this work, but I had done some research, I was in Boston, and I went to the library up there and found this really great transcript of a woman who was a plaintiff in a case on birth control. And I sent it to this group, National Family Planning and Reproductive Health group I'd work with, because it was about their work. And they called and said, are you doing oral history? It's our 50th anniversary. We need you to interview people. And I did. So that was a whole project that actually is still ongoing. Benji's been our advisor and consultant on it. And I met people from all over the country in that. And I guess I should step back a second and say, yes, I'm a lawyer, but I'm not a litigation lawyer. I've always done policy and legislative work. So I'd be curious, Benji, as to what you see in my interviews that reflects lawyering. But at any rate, that leads to some of the next steps that I'm going to talk about. So I went to a lecture on women's history, something I'm interested in. I lived through a lot of it myself. And a woman was there from the Veteran Feminists of America. I'd never heard of them. Well, it turns out it's an organization that feels its responsibility is to capture the stories of people who were involved in the women's movement in the 60s and 70s. Now, as we all know, there was a whole lot of movements going on in those times: civil rights movement, opposition to the Vietnam War, and the so-called second wave of the women's movement. First wave being suffragists, which kind of concluded with white women getting the vote. We know it took the civil rights movement to get Black women the vote, but I digress. At any rate, so I went up to her afterwards. I loved her stories. And she said, I know who you are. I want to interview you. And I said, well, I want to do interviews. And a relationship was born. So in fact, I have been doing interviews for Veteran Feminists of America now. Well, it started before the pandemic. And I will say it got me through the pandemic. What happens is, again, as one thing leads to another, they gave me some names to start with. I, of course, had been involved in the movement myself and knew people, and started with some lawyers I knew, of course, and everybody gives me more names. So this is not going to be ever finished, really. They could use as many interviewers as possible, but it has just been an amazing experience for me and a delight. So what I wanted to talk about before, as I get to my clips, is how I've used Benji's quote moves or techniques throughout the work. So one of the first things is to ask general questions, and we kind of talked about that a little. Interestingly, I'll call it VFA, Veteran Feminists of America from now on. VFA had its own list of questions, but in fact they are very broad, so it made it really easy, starting with your childhood. When did you get involved in the movement? What were your main concerns? How did you work on them? Give me a good story that you remember, and so on and so forth. So that really lends to following the narrator and picking up on the story that person is telling. I got involved, again, from people giving me other names, with a number of women who were in the National Women's Political Caucus, which started in the 70s. It's actually how I got involved in the movement, because I joined that group in 1972 to work on the Shirley Chisholm campaign. And you may recall, or if you don't, that's why I'm giving this background, that it was very bipartisan. You had to believe in the principles, but there are many Republicans and Democrats. And so I got to interview both Republicans and Democrats, and then in groups as well as individually. Very enlightening to me. Anyway, one of the women I interviewed, she was telling me her childhood. It was very white, conservative in the Midwest, but she went to Wellesley. And it was in the 60s, and I knew about Wellesley in the 60s. And at one point I said, did you know Hillary Clinton? Because I knew that's when she went there. And she said, oh yes, she followed me as head of the Young Republicans Club. So that was using another one of Benji's techniques, which is asking a question either from your own knowledge or from some research you've done about the person in advance. And I thought that was a great win, great remark. So I am going to get to a clip now, just a slight background. In 1968, oh, I should also say women at the time were called women libbers, they were called bra burners, they were called many names you could make up, and that would be right. So in 1968, a group of women who called themselves New York Radical Women decided to go to Atlantic City and protest the Miss America pageant. I mean, I do remember this because I was from Philadelphia and we used to go to Atlantic City when we went to the beach. This woman, who you will hear a clip from, was a photographer, and she wrote songs that they sang and at the time, and anyway, why don't we play the clip and then I'll elaborate after.
Important because it was really national, radical women action, and it got covered.
And did you burn your bras?
No, we didn't.
Say it again.
Nobody burned their bra. The boardwalk is a wooden boardwalk. You cannot burn anything on the boardwalk. What we had was a Freedom trash can. And so people brought bras and girdles and high heels and Good Housekeeping and Playboy magazines and dumped them in the Freedom trash can and
Okay, so you get the idea there too, that I knew that they didn't burn their bras, but that's not what most people know. And so I asked the question at that time and I loved the answer. It was really fun to hear it. Moving on then, one of my, I don't know if I call it problems, but skills I need to practice more is listening and not interrupting because I always have questions and I always want to know what this and that. So the two examples I gave you were very on point, but I really have to practice listening. And of course, then I feel like I get rewards for that. So a little background on this next one where I got a reward. And this is, again, I did a lot of reproductive rights. So, and you all probably know, but women always have tried to control their fertility, starting in Greek times and so on and so forth, and into this country. The colonists brought all of the indigenous people were very concerned about food supply. They had all kinds of techniques. Colonists brought all the rules and laws from their countries. Everybody did whatever they did until around the 1800s when the AMA got very involved in wanting to be professional and get rid of all those women healers and that sort of thing, midwives, et cetera. And so abortion state by state was banned through the 1800s to 1910. But again, the 1960s, things were starting to change. Some states were changing, but there were all those protests, legal action, which of course led to Roe v. Wade in 1973, which said, okay, within certain parameters, abortion is legal. And states started putting a whole lot of restrictions on. And so in 1992, the next big case on this issue was before the court. It was Casey versus Planned Parenthood of Southeast Pennsylvania, Casey being governor of Pennsylvania and the father of our current senator. And I luckily got to interview one of the co-counsels of that case. Okay, let's hear that clip. This is when I shut up.
Let me back up. In conference, we now know that 5 votes were cast to overturn Roe, and Chief Justice Rehnquist actually wrote a majority opinion, a draft opinion, overturning Roe. I have a copy of it now. But the Supreme Court process is that anyone after casting their vote can change their mind, up until the point the opinion is released. So sometime in May, Justice Kennedy writes a note to Harry Blackmun, and that note is in Harry Blackmun's file. It's not an email message, it's a handwritten note. And it says to Harry Blackmun, Harry, I'd like to see you. Some of what I have to say to you will come as welcome news. And apparently they go out into the garden of the Supreme Court, and Kennedy tells him that he's decided to change his vote, to uphold, everything except yes, to uphold everything except the husband notification provision, but to not overturn the core of Roe, and instead to substitute this undue burden opinion, undue burden standard, which actually is a little bit different than a little bit more forgiving than the original O'Connor undue burden standard.
So I did not know that background information. Again, as a lawyer in reproductive rights, it was, wow, that's interesting. By the way, I do want to say that Blackmun, who wrote Roe, and the 3 justices that wound up writing Casey were all Republicans. So it gives you a little sense of the different times we are in. At any rate, I have found out after that this was public knowledge, but to me, it was very eye-opening. Okay, so really, I should also say, of course, we're at another crossroads with the new Texas and Mississippi laws before the Supreme Court, and maybe we'll have a compromise again. I don't know. But a shout out to DC, as DC actually does care about women's health. This is another aside, but I can't help myself. DC has passed a law to protect women's ability to get the kind of contraception and abortion they may need. And also recently has put a lot of money into the abominable problem of Black maternal mortality. So DC does pay attention to women's health. Okay, so what I have learned to do to stop myself from interrupting too many times, because I have gotten rewards when I don't, is I take notes and I write questions that I have. So instead of saying them, I've got them down on the paper. And then when the interview is over, well, sometimes I can go back and ask one if it seems appropriate, but other times I will just ask them for my own information after the interview is over. And I will also say these questions kind of help a bonding with the narrator. You know, it becomes a point where not only was I kind of listening, but engaged in what their story was, which I think contributes to the experience. And so what I have found is that the people I interview are always grateful. I mean, of course, I try to contact a lot of people and don't get responses from a lot. I do want to say that. Not everybody wants to do it, but the ones that do wind up being very grateful for the work and for the fact this will be it's kept in perpetuity. And of course, I am very grateful for the opportunity to interview them. And it's been an incredibly rewarding experience.
Thank you so much, Judy. And thank you, panelists, really such beautiful reflections from all three of you. Again, I'm really honored to hear about your own growth, you know what I mean? And the little role that I played in, you know, in planting a seed for it. I'm gonna have to look back at the moves document because it's been a while, but it sounds like that one was a generative one. Just a couple reflections on Judy's remarks, and then we'll transition into our discussion. You know, you said a couple things, Judy. One is that this interviewing got you through the pandemic. I think that cannot be overstated. And you said at the very beginning, you said that one thing leads to another. And you mentioned how a relationship was born out of this kind of casual conversation you had with, I think, the director of the Veteran Feminists Project. And it's precisely this idea of one thing leads to another, and being kind of open to and conscious of how potential opportunities are always coming our way. And oral history really is an art of connecting, not just in the interview itself, but in terms of making projects happen, finding narrators, you know, maybe unexpected narrators. Like if you've got your antenna open to, oh, well, this person can make sense in this scene, or, you know, this project might work if I talk to this person. Or, I mean, in my own case, like I'm writing a biography of an Afro-American man who was raised in a very traditional, historic church in Little Rock. And so when I meet Damien and Panda, it's like, of course I'm going to come to church with you guys. Like, can I please? I think I asked, you know, I don't, you know, I think I kind of imposed on you all to invite me. And so it's that kind of one thing leads to another, and being deliberate about that, and open to it and enthusiastic about it. That really, to me, speaks to how oral history in all its facets, in the interview and project design, even something you and I have talked about, Judy, oral history as a way of life, really is an art of flowing. And I think, of course, part of what made the pandemic so hard is it just like stopped all flow, right? Like you had to stop your flow for months and months. And so it's really nice to hear how, you know, the work sustained you and kind of kept you going, kept you flowing, even when you weren't able to, you know, leave the confines of your house. So that's really sweet. And on a more kind of technical note, in terms of oral history technique, you know, you bringing up, you're asking this question, did you know Hillary Clinton, to someone who was there at the same time and place as she was. That's a great example of asking an informed question. And I think this is something I've tried to get at in explaining how we do oral history. Like, this is why it helps to have an agenda. This is why it helps to be prepared, as Pandit says. Like, you want to make the most of the time you have with your narrator. You don't want to ask them questions that they've already answered 100 times over in other interviews. Or you don't want to let an opportunity go by to ask a question like that could really, spark an interesting thread in the discussion. And so bringing your informed perspective to the interview is something I think is crucial to what we do. Yeah, there's more I can say, but I think I'll leave it there for now. I'm curious, before we open it up, or as we open it up, before I kind of impose too much structure on the discussion, panelists, do you all have any reflections or questions or thoughts for each other? I'm already seeing some connections, but I'm going to be kind of light in my agenda and just invite any of you all to talk to each other.
Oh, Benji, that would take up all the time.
Exactly.
Well, if that's how we're going to play it, then let me be a little more.
Thank you, though.
I'll put some structure here. One thing I'm noticing that I hadn't thought of yet until hearing all three of you talk is, so I'm curious if any of you can speak to what it's like to bring a formal oral history process into spaces where more kind of where the transmission of oral history is already such a key part of the culture and the spaces sustaining itself, right? When I think of the church, especially the Black church, when I think of, activist circles, like these are spaces in which, living memory, so-called war stories, right? Like, especially in like the veteran feminist stuff, like there's a way in which oral history in an informal way, or in a non-professionalized way, we can say, is already at the heart of the space. And so I'm wondering if you all can talk about what was it like to introduce a more formal, professionalized, perhaps, kind of oral history process. If you need me to refine the question, let me know, but does that spark anything for you all?
So I'll start. I think, as I said before, 19th Street, and I dare say, I think I think at that point we looked to Asbury as kind of like, the standard in terms of kind of what a true a project looked like or an initiative looked like. But I think 19th Street in their own way had already kind of started this. It had this drive to kind of preserve, particularly, like I said, through Deaconess White, who I see has joined us. There was this desire to really make sure that we were preserving that history. So, I think there is that tradition, the storytelling tradition, the oral tradition, but oral history as a way to actually codify and preserve it. I think that's where you introduce the approach, you introduce the how to record, how to get the most out of that process. Because again, like you said, you have excellent storytellers in churches. Narration and journey is a part of the Black church in itself, as a part of all that pageantry, but actually formally trying to capture that information so that other generations could actually hear it. I think people were open to it and they wanted to know how to do it. Particularly, like I said, Deaconess White, who actually kind of moved forward and wanted to get other people trained in it.
Yeah, I think at Asbury, there's been archivists and historians for a long time. Again, being the cold water pourer, I just want to say that an important thing to think about as you start your project is, can you answer the questions though? Where is this going to reside? How can I access this material? You know, what will I be able to what's that word, that bad word? You know, what can I take back? What can I retract from my interview? Okay. And then all of the interpretations of, when do you sign the release form? And, you know, what can you do with this information? These are important things. I think the People's Archive, the digital archive that was mentioned at the beginning, that's huge, because now you can easily say, this is where your stuff is going to be, okay? It may be in the church also, but here's where it's going to be for all these people in perpetuity that we talk about that are going to come and see your stuff. So I think even though we have that oral tradition of telling stories and sharing stories, that formal process, it's more than a notion, and you have to be able, I don't like to go out and talk to people about stuff like that if I don't have the answers. Really happy with the flow. You know, you can sit and talk to me back and forth all day long about the other stuff, but there are some technical questions and some, you know, some true answers that that you just have to answer. And once you do, we found that people were you know, really happy to share and to go on. And I think the most interesting thing in the Asbury process has been the panel that Adele Banks, who we mentioned, is the project director this past year. And it's the panel that gets put together at the end of the oral histories, where the historians can sit together in a space. We did it on Zoom this time. Okay, but at any rate, just getting people together, however you get them together, I think is helpful. And that's when real stories start to come out, when those folks can interact with each other and questions can be shared and answered.
Mhm. I'll add one quick thing that Pandit sort of touched on, and that is, can I take back something I said? So I think that's really an important aspect. And we had debated, well, not in the VFA, but the other project, should we say, okay, you know, these interviews will not be available till X 20 years after you're gone, or something like that, or, you know, 2025 or 2050, or can we give the narrator an opportunity to delete things? And we decided we really wanted to be able to share them. And so we decided to give them an opportunity to be able to delete pieces of what they said. So it makes the process more cumbersome. Obviously, in all of the projects I've done, there is a transcriber, and then one sends it to the narrator, and then getting it back from them is often not easy, because that's another step. And I will say, for myself being interviewed, I was okay with what I actually said, but I realized that, at least when I saw it in writing, that I did not speak in full sentences. And it was kind of shocking. I was like, how do people understand what I'm saying? Because I speak in, you know, well, you know, long sentences or short clips. But so people then want to edit it, you know, to make it more appropriate for reading something. And I have to say, no, really, this is your tone. This is how you sound. It's okay. I had the same problem. But still, I think it's important to give the narrator the opportunity to take a look, and with all the problems that come with it.
Great, thanks, Judy. Having had the privilege of conducting your interview, I'll say you made yourself perfectly clear. I never once didn't know what you were talking about, and it was really eloquent. But no, great reflections, all. Thanks. So we have a nice generative question here in the Q&A from Mr. Leon. It says, what are your thoughts on video versus audio only in doing your interviews? Do you have recommendations on recording and transcribing devices and software? Let me amplify this question a little bit by adding that, as you know, former students of mine know, I always say there are very few ironclad rules when it comes to doing oral history. It's much more about the spirit in which you're doing it than any kind of particular technology you're employing, because really any conversation-based, encounter-based project, I think, can be imbued with the spirit of oral history. And even something you said very early on, Panda, in your remarks, how you've been asking yourself, can I use these skills of oral history to capture the stories of my family and friends? Like, oral history is really like a mode of conversation you can drop into at any time. When you're meeting someone for the first time, when you're seeing an old friend, when you're talking to a colleague, like you can kind of enter that oral history mode that's just a little deeper, kind of whenever you want. And so I'm saying that to say that, Mr. Leon's questions here to me get at, the way I'll reframe his question for you particularly is, what are the ways in which, for your particular objectives and needs and constraints in your projects, how have you navigated these decisions around audio versus video? Do you transcribe? If so, why and how? How have you kind of created that more technical infrastructure of your project around, again, the primary objectives and the needs and even sometimes constraints that your project is facing?
Well, if you're working on a grant, the grant usually is going to prescribe what you're going to do as far as even down to the recording, whether it's Tascam or what's the other one that we had to use, HP1 Zoom, was that the name of the camera? And so it's those kinds of things, and they'll tell you exactly the format that has to be transcribed. If not, if you're just doing this on your own, I look at all the reviews on Amazon, and then in some of the audiophile magazines, and people will tell you exactly what they've used that gives them the best quality production. We had to transcribe, again, in a grant project, we had to transcribe. And then there are so many different software products that are out there. One year we used one where we actually sat ourselves. You send in the tape and of the interview, and then they send it back to you, in a written version online or digital, and then you go through it yourself, as opposed to actually working with a transcribing company. I know, Benji, you have different, sort of thoughts about transcription and what that's all about. But again, if you are working with a particular sponsor of your project or what you are doing, it's pretty much up to them to tell you how to do it. I would think that, though, just personally, transcription is helpful because I like to see, what is it that happened here, and understanding the flow, understanding that flow, which is so important. And I have to say that when you're in the moment of doing the interview, that's one of the more challenging things to me. I sort of felt like sometimes it's a high wire act, because at the same time that you're trying to hear the person, and I mean really hear them, listening to them, engaging with them, while you have to also make sure that you are fulfilling, there is always an agenda. I don't care what we say, again, you're trying to get to certain things and stay on some sort of a cohesive track. Difficult, because like you, Judy, I always have 1,000 more questions that I want to ask. You say this, I say that, okay? And so while you're sitting there, you're then also worrying, is my recording device still going? Did something shut off in the meantime? I've had this happen, okay? And so, Ms. Leon, as you asked that question, yes, you got to always be measuring, those technical questions with being in the moment and accomplishing the goal that you have set for your interaction, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, beautifully said. Thanks, Panda. Other thoughts on this, Damien or Judy?
Well, in terms of the equipment or preference, I think that because I kind of introduced I guess from what I had done, I'd taken from the course, I just introduced the notion of using an actual recorder. We didn't have funding. And I think initially it was purposeful not to use the funding because there was a larger project that had money behind it. So we didn't actually have kind of mandates that we went through. It's interesting about the transcription, because I think I remember when I first sent my field notes to you, and there was a little bit of that social science thing kind of coming in, and I ended up, as a part of field notes, literally transcribing everything. So minute 5.6, I'm typing like paragraphs. And you know, I kind of go to Pandit, and maybe it's a little bit of my training. I do like to read it, but I also see the freedom in not kind of having to place things on text and literally listening, because it requires you to be present. Or at least from my perspective, it required me to be present. But yeah, we never really thought, I don't think we thought about the video unless for the church's purposes, it was going to be something that would be shared, or that I think for the commemorative, for the 180th, they had talked about maybe doing a CD where you're collecting this. So that required some type of formatting, but, you know, we were kind of free to kind of explore however we wanted to, you know, to do it. And I have to say this about the interviews. I rarely had a moment where they were tired of talking.
True.
So
That's not the problem.
Right.
I think with Mrs. Jordan's interview, we were going for, I think it was like an hour 49, and she was ready to keep going. So I think that, you know, I was able to kind of give them space to have, you know, for their journey. And I would write those questions down, and I found, you know, I could find a way to kind of come back to them, but, you know, they wanted to talk. So
That's awesome. Just before you go, Judy, I just to bounce off what Damien said, that's so great, because oral history interviews should be relatively long. They should be an hour and a half, 2 hours. Obviously, you know, you might have constraints. Sometimes there are people who do get tired. You know, you might have to do it in 1 hour segments. I mean, some projects do, you know, half-hour segments, but to me, that just feels too short. You know what I mean? And I think it's a mark of success, just like you're saying, Damien, when you have someone who's willing to just talk for 3 hours in the same way that they would if you were just in their living room anyways, right? Like, people can talk for hours and hours when it doesn't feel like a task. And I think that's part of the art of doing oral history, is to kind of gently, right, to balance that agenda with this kind of open atmosphere. Kind of like we're doing right now. Like, I don't feel like I'm working too hard. You know what I mean? Like, I'm just kind of giving you guys space, and we're just jamming. So yeah, the long form interview, I think, is something definitely to be pursued and valued.
You know, that'll just inform whether or not the video versus audio. People, in a way, if you know that you have to be looking at yourself, that kind of constrains you a little bit, you know. And people always used to ask me as an interviewer, right, Judy, if you're the interviewer, I want to see you too. I'm like, why? I don't have anything to do with this. You don't need to see me. But when you're doing these as again, as Damien said, as a format that is going to be shared, the video somehow makes it more, I don't know, official, formal, engaging, interesting, and it certainly, I think, is more engaging for the viewer than to just have the audio. But for comfort purposes, to me, if you would just, you know, if you didn't have to do that part, if you were in person recording, that would be my ideal. Judy, what is your thought on that?
Yeah, no, I agree with everything you say. I think some people turn down the interview because they are self-conscious or, you know, that kind of thing. And I have seen people, you know, fluff up their hair and this is whatever. But the veteran feminist group, they want a video because what they do with them is each person has a page on the website, veteranfeministsofamerica.org, if you want to look it up. So I will do the video interview, and then, as I said, it's transcribed. So the transcription is on each person's page. And then they add a whole bunch of other stuff about their life and, you know, professional things connected to the interview. And also they ask for a picture from back in the day and a more current picture. So it is kind of not complete, but a fuller view of the individual and their story. And so I get why they want to do it, and that's what we do.
And Benji, you talked about the length of the interview. You know, in my very first project, the one where I wasn't pronouncing the man's name right, the one where the one where it was like an hour, and I'm like, okay, goodbye, that's it, thank you very much. And then I had one in this last cycle where the man was just laconic. You know, he said what he had to say, and he wasn't saying any more. And again, the preparation made all the difference, because if you have that set of questions that you can at least go back and say, all right, well then tell me what it was like in 72 when you were at the University of whatever. What did that campus feel like during those days, blah, blah, blah. And then the last difficulty one is the people who, they're guarded. They're just guarded personality, and they only are going to share X, you know? And then, you know, you say, you come back with your two-step question. Okay, so is, you know, I hate this from my HR days, is what I'm hearing you say, I believe I'm hearing you say, blah, blah, blah. And you try to get that with them and they're like, yep, uh-huh, that's it. So there's always some skills that have to be used. And I find it is going back to starting the relationship. If you have a relationship with somebody, or some place that you can pull some common ground before you begin the interview, so you know, oh yeah, for example, yeah, my grandma lived in such and such a town, or I've, you know, eaten donuts my whole life and I see you're a donut eater. Those kinds of things, I think, are some of those moves, right, Benji, that can help you get to the end without killing yourself and the other person too.
Absolutely, yeah. You want to, you know, rapport matters a lot. Rapport is worth everything, and the only way you can really expect your narrator to be their full selves, to be a human being in the interview and not just like a face, you know, not you know, like you need to be yourself too. And again, this is something that the more traditional social scientists have a little trouble with, is the like, what do you mean I'm supposed to use the first person? What do you mean I'm like supposed to share a memory of my own to get them to talk? What? Like that would contaminate the data. That's not allowed, you know? And again, it's like, no, you're here to connect and to draw things out. A kind of governing concept in oral history is the idea of intersubjectivity, right? So, you know, if Pandit's doing an interview with a church member, it's going to be a little different than if Adele does it. And that's great, you know, and that's something to pay attention to and to embrace, because it just is, that's just the way life is, you know, and so that's great. I want to be mindful of time, so this will be kind of our wrap-up question, because I need to give a couple minutes to Jasper at the end to talk about the upcoming Humanities DC grants. So I'm going to address a few questions, kind of combine them that are in the chat here, a couple questions. First of all, Ms. McKinley Grant is asking, do you give an honorarium for your interview? I'll let you all answer that in your, like in the chat. I think maybe Adele, I know you're here, you can talk about how the ASRE process works. Just for you to know, Ms. McKinley Grant, this is a hot question in oral history today. The answer just a few years ago used to be like, no, never, because we basically kind of patterned ourselves off of journalists. Like journalists would never pay a source to speak on a story. There's now quite a bit of movement to change this thinking, and there's a lot of debate. And this is, in fact, in the Race and Power Symposium that I'm co-chairing that we'll be doing in June 2022. One of the papers is going to be making a pretty forceful argument for everybody needs to be paid. This, of course, raises lots of questions. Not everybody is down with it. I don't know quite how I feel about it. I think it ought to be a case-by-case thing. But the question of do you pay your narrators used to be a settled one and no longer is within the field. So, you know, more on that maybe in some other venues. And then I'm going to go back up and just combine Mr. Elliott's question with Ms. Cohall's question. So, Mr. Elliott, nice to see you here. It says, prior to the oral history project, I was not aware of the People's Archives. And I think he might be referring to Judy, your project, the Veteran Feminists, the People's Archives. He asks, what can be done to make the public aware of and able to access this material? So that's one question. And then I'm going to combine that with Ms. Cohall's question, which is any guidance on creating a project based on existing oral histories where you aren't able to create the questions in advance. So great question. This happens a lot. Like one of the kind of curses of doing oral history is that you generate all this wonderful primary source material, and then it sits in an archive. And so there's a lot of exciting opportunities, you know, for people to come along later and use that archival material in, you know, more creative curatorial kinds of ways. And so if anybody wants to talk about how, you know, I see these questions as connected because it's about how do we take the material that we generate in the interviews and make them public, you know, whether it's material that we generated ourselves or previous material that might resonate with our own interview, you know, the interview material we're generating ourselves. Any thoughts on this, panelists?
Well, I just want to say, I think it was Pandit who mentioned people. archives.
Mhm.
So I'll let you do that. But as I mentioned quickly, that it's true, the one with the reproductive health group is in an archive, and it will be where you can go there and look at it at actually at Smith College. And I did mention that the veteran feminists have realized they need to make it more public. So it will ultimately all be at some archive. They haven't decided which university, but it is all accessible online, as I mentioned, at veteranfeministsofamerica.org. I don't think many groups actually do that, make it that available immediately. So, and I don't know how many people know about it, but anyway, it is there. And
Thank you. Yeah, what I was saying about People's Archive is Dig DC. And basically, I think everybody's job now is marketing. You know, we just have to find ways to get the name out there and let people understand what's available, because I certainly didn't know it was there either, and came across it when I was doing the interview for Reverend Pierce, who had been interviewed several years ago. And her interview was there, which was super helpful to me because I was able to just go and look at the transcript of what she had said. And I didn't have to go through, as you said, Benji, I didn't have to take her through the first 50 years of her life because it's right there, right? Let's get on to the new things. So that's
where is it, Panda? Can you be more?
It's in the chat. It's in the chat. Dig DC Archive. It's right. It's right there. And you know, that's just super important resource to have. It's also what Jasper's going to finish up talking about. It is unique that the District of Columbia cares enough about this as a practice to sponsor grants, to sponsor training, and to make this a tool that's accessible and doable for the people, whether it's grant supported or not. Get you thinking in that way. Yes, I can preserve these stories of my friends, my family, myself, you know, whoever it is. So that's terrific. It's been a great blessing to be able to do this.
That's awesome. Damien, any last thoughts?
Sorry, I couldn't get off mute. I would just say, just listening to everybody and thinking about my own journey, be present. You know, remember the guide, but don't be locked to the guide. Listening is hard. You may think you're the best listener in the world, but you can always practice at it. And honor the people who you are interviewing. I think we talk a lot about honorariums and monetary. I sent handwritten thank you notes afterwards. And I remember one person in particular say, I'm not sure if it was Mrs. Jordan, she really talked about how she appreciated the note. So honor them because they are sharing their journey with you.
Yes, thank you for that reminder, Damien, that we can always improve as listening. Here I am, like, misinterpreting Mr. Elliott's question based on information that was said in the session that I missed. So my apologies. The People's Archive at MLK Library. Yeah, thank you all panelists so much. I wish we could keep going. I'm sure we'll do this again at some point in some way. Really, really grateful to you for your time and your effort for this panel specifically, and just for being in the world of oral history. The field really is richer for your participation in it. And I'm glad to have played a role in it. And that, again, like, as Judy said, one thing leads to another. You know, these friendships that have developed out of the work we've done together on the collaborative and projects that are born out of that is really a blessing, really amazing. So with that, I will turn it over to Jasper, and just want to thank the audience for being such attentive listeners. Thank you.
Great. Benji, Judy, Damien, Pandit, thank you all so much for this. This has been just an incredible program, and I actually look forward to kind of going back to the recording. I wanted to kind of say that because it's another way for me to let everybody know that, you know, we are recording this, and you'll be able to kind of go back and review it, send it to people who you think might get something out of it, but it'll be on Humanities DC's YouTube channel. So thank you all so much for doing this panel, Benji for moderating. It's been really great to listen to. Just a quick second to plug the DCOHC grants, which were just released on Thursday for FY22. The 3 grant programs that we have are for new projects, and this is projects that don't necessarily have to be newly started, but they're new to the DC Oral History Collaborative. So they can be projects that are in progress that you want to, get some funding to complete some more oral histories for. But those awards are up to $8,000. The project period is roughly March through October. And the RFPs for all of these are available on Humanities DC's website, and Tracy just put the link to those in the chat. There's also a grant for people who have successfully completed projects with DCOHC in the past and want to apply to extend and continue those projects. And then there's also a grant which always produces some really exciting work for public projects and events that are created through existing oral history. So that can be anything from documentary films, listening stations, exhibitions, lesson plans, curricula, anything that kind of brings those oral histories out of the archive. And I feel like that's kind of like a little bit of a way, I think, to answer the question that Claude was asking about how do we kind of improve people's understanding of knowledge that these resources exist. There's actually a grant for people who want to produce programs that can kind of draw attention to and bring those oral histories out of the archive. So I know that was very quick. All that information is available on that website that Tracy put in the chat, but thank you all again for joining us. And we look forward to having you at the next coffee chat.
Thank you
so much.
Thanks,
Jasper.
everybody.
Bye, everybody.
There's one last question in the Q&A about advice on accessible oral history practices. I mean, I think there's so many ways to go there. I think the Oral History Association is a place to start, and of course the collaborative is always offering opportunities like this, I think, to make to kind of demystify what we do. One of our panelists was saying something to this effect, and I think it's very true that oral history is a very democratic practice. That's really what it's about. You don't have to have a master's degree to do this. It's something I always say, oral history is very easy to do, but can be difficult to master. And so the more you're doing it, the more you're in touch with people who do it. Lots of people do oral history work without calling it oral history as such. And so again, kind of keeping your antenna open for those potential connections, resonances, learning opportunities, et cetera. Hopefully you can kind of make it accessible for yourself. So just want to end on that note of thanks, Jasper, for everything that you do as the director of the collaborative. It's really a special venue within the field. I'm not really aware of any other venue like it that does this kind of citywide grassroots, oral history work. It's really special.
Thanks, Benji.
All right. Thanks, everybody.